Welcome back, everybody. This is PCS 101 for our Thursday class, the 23rd. And I hope at this point you would have had a chance to view the video that I had posted for Tuesday. And you can see that for this class, we've got 3 chapters scheduled. Chapter 7, Organizing and Outlining. Chapter 8, Beginning and Ending. And lastly, Chapter 9, Wording Speeches. And you can also see that at the top of the notes here, what I've indicated is that you've got 2 options in which to decide how to deliver your speech. You can do so live via Zoom, or if it turns out that you're not available then, or that's not an option for you, what you can do is upload your speech onto Moodle, and then the class can review your speech that way. So what I am asking you to do is to indicate which one you would prefer. And for those of you who would prefer to deliver your speech via Zoom, note that our first speech would be on Tuesday, 8/4. So please send me your hours of availability during Tuesday, 8/4. And what I'm going to do is to try to find a common time where all of us who are interested, or at least most of us who are interested in delivering a speech via Zoom, will be able to do so. And again, you can send that to my email, and that's ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. If you select the other option for delivering your speech, basically you would be recording your speech and then you would be uploading that onto our Moodle site on Tuesday, August 4th. And then I will give the class instructions on how to view that particular speech and how to give some feedback about that particular speech. So, in terms of thinking about speech number 1, as you know, it is an autobiographical speech. So you have approximately 5 minutes to tell the class a little bit about yourself. And that said, certainly one of the biggest challenges in delivering a speech is being able to adapt the speech to fit into the time frame that you're given to speak. And the longer the speech, well, then the more flexibility that you have. So I'm thinking in something like a 5-minute speech, you would have about 30 seconds to a minute wiggle room in terms of going under or in terms of going over. Certainly you wouldn't want to go over by 5 minutes for a 5-minute speech, because that's a double. Now, if you were giving an hour speech, and don't panic, you're not, but if you were giving an hour speech and you went over by 5 minutes, well, then that wouldn't be too terrible. So it's ultimately a question of balance. And as the speeches progress in length, you've got a little bit more wiggle room. What I'll be doing is, as I'm listening to your speech, I will be noting your start and stop time on a piece of paper. So if there is an issue in terms of your time, I will let you know. If it turns out that you are going so over that I'm afraid that we might not have enough time to finish all of the speeches, I will let you know during your speech, but I try not to intervene during the actual speech itself. And as I indicated, what I will be doing for the first speech is using that template, which I've posted on our Moodle site, that gives an overview of some of the elements of speech delivery, both in terms of content as well as in terms of delivery. And that's basically what our textbook is talking about and what the Toastmasters video talked about as well. And I actually received a very interesting question in the chat room, which I've held our first chat room at this point, about why they name themselves Toastmasters. And they're talking about a toast in terms of that a celebratory speech that's usually given at a dinner or some sort of a social function. And usually that's done over a beverage, more often than not an alcoholic beverage. We'll call that a toast. So in other words, these individuals are masters or skilled at being able to give these speeches in a social setting, which gets us right back to how we began last class by talking a little bit about some of the reasons why it's important to study public speaking and the social imperative. In other words, that as social beings, we interact with one another, and we will be in situations where we might need to give a speech or a toast, and that ultimately we wanted to be able to have those skills, as well as being just an educated individual and understanding about rhetoric and communication, and that's the intellectual imperative. And then ultimately, finally, us as audience, as consumers of speeches, so that we could evaluate those speeches critically. So that's the consumer imperative. that we were talking about last class. And as you can see, the textbook is basically introducing some terms that are associated with the discipline, as well as some suggestions on how to proceed with putting together your speech. And probably the most important suggestion you're going to find is the suggestion in Chapter 7, organizing and outlining, that all of the prep work for your speech will pay off when you are actually delivering your speech. Even if it's a speech that you have a good understanding of the content, and you do for your first speech, you have lived experience that you will be sharing with us. You probably know that better than any other subject, what you've experienced in your life. It becomes only more challenging when you have to talk about content that you don't have that much familiarity with. But even something that you do have familiarity with, you want to do some preparation ahead of time. And basically what that means is that you're going to try to outline and organize your main points. And some of the reasons why you want to take the time to do this is that it generally, when you do that, it's easier for you to remember the points that you're going to be sharing with your audience. It's easier to present those points to your audience. You're usually more credible as a speaker because you look like you're more organized and you're more professional and prepared. And usually you're more persuasive as well. And where we're beginning is the thesis, or the central idea. So where I left off with you last class is that you are speaking about yourself, but you need to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to give a life overview, or perhaps focus on a particular element in your life, or perhaps you would like to talk about education. And over the next couple classes, I'll be showing you some sample autobiographical speeches so that you could see how others have done that. Individuals not in any way connected with GCC, so that we can be free to be as critical as we need to be without in any way hurting anybody's feelings. And certainly we'll be more critical with sample speeches than we would ever be with our own speeches, if for no other reason. The sample speeches are speeches that we can watch multiple times and critique, which usually is not the case when a speech is delivered. Usually it's delivered in the moment, and that's that. The organizational plan, how to go about putting together your arguments. And in some ways this is very similar to what you might have been doing when you were putting together a paper in, let's say, a Composition 1 class. That there are no particular formulas. There are lots of different ways you can organize your information as long as it makes sense to the audience. That said, there are some patterns, and I suspect you've probably used some of these techniques in relation to your organizing your own papers. Outside of the intro and the body and the conclusion, which is the general structure, the beginning, the middle, and the end, in terms of thinking about how you're going to organize those arguments in the middle, chronological, for instance, is a very popular way of doing that. Time order. First this, then that. That works particularly well if you're describing a process or you're trying to teach somebody how to do something, because usually the future step is dependent on the previous step. You could talk about things in terms of categories or topics, and that again is a very common technique for structuring, let's say, an English paper. You could put things based on order of importance. Now there's some subjectivity here in terms of you're determining what is the most important and then what is the least important. And then there's the question of, do you begin with the most important information so that you can basically impress your audience? But the consequences of that might be that as your evidence gets weaker, your audience might be less invested in your position. Or we can do it the opposite way, in that we can start with the least important information first and then build up to the most important information so that you leave your audience with a lasting impression. But the caution with that is that your audience may not necessarily stick with you to the end for your most impressive piece of information. So a lot of it is going to depend on your subject. A lot of it is going to depend on you and what feels comfortable to you as a speaker. And a lot of it is ultimately going to depend on the audience and how the audience reacts to the particular topic. So all of those are elements that you need to consider when you are going through pulling together order of importance. Another way of putting together a speech is spatial. And basically what you're doing is you're talking about location. This works very nicely if you're trying to describe something. So I oftentimes use the example of a real estate agent trying to sell a house, and that ultimately that real estate agent has multiple decisions to make about how to present that house in the most positive light. And certainly the house has certain attributes, but the real estate agent also has to think about the individuals who are viewing the house and what matters to them. And also the real estate agent is probably well aware that they have themselves strengths and weaknesses in terms of presentation. So they want to capitalize on their strengths. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to talk about that house from a chronological perspective. We could talk about it in terms of time order, particularly if it were a very old house, that it was constructed in the mid-1800s, and give its history to present day. That said, we could also do something very similar with a brand new construction that oftentimes is appealing to potential home buyers, that no one's ever lived in that house before. It's new, so to speak. I don't know if the chronological method of organization would necessarily be the best way to sell a house that's 40 or 50 years old, a house that isn't necessarily new or old. You might perhaps discuss that house in terms of topics, that there are 3 or 4 major elements that you want to highlight about that particular house. You might want to talk about that house in terms of order of importance and putting what's most important first or last in your argument. And again, that could be variable depending on your audience, or in this instance, the individuals, the home buyers who are thinking about purchasing that house. And while one family might be most concerned about neighborhood and school districts, another family might be perhaps more interested in something like recent renovations to the home. So again, what's important to one may not necessarily be important to another, so there's some level of subjectivity. But if we were going to talk about that house in terms of it in relation to its spatial elements, well, then I could describe that home to you, that you walk into the house and immediately to your left is the living room, and then you walk up a series of steps, and then that would get you into the kitchen, and that kitchen on the right hand side is a small bedroom that could be used as a den, and then on the left is, let's say, a dining room, and that leads off to a deck with a sliding glass door. And obviously you've never been in this home, but my description of the home spatially gives you an idea of how that home might appear. So it's not that one organizational method is better than another. It's just a matter of what your topic is, what your preference is, and who your audience happens to be. Even something like a causal, or the idea of cause and effect organization. Though, as we'll talk about with errors in reasoning later on in the semester, that can get tricky, because sometimes what appears to be the cause of an effect really isn't. So sometimes it's very difficult to determine a specific cause and its specific effect, because there could be lots of outside variables that are playing a role. So some suggestions in terms of thinking about how audience members tend to be receptive towards information. Talking about things that are familiar. This is an old teacher trick. Talk about the old content first and then build upon that. Asking questions. If you've ever heard of the Socratic method, again, old teacher trick. By asking questions, you can get your audience invested in trying to supply some answers. Even if it's a rhetorical question, a question which you never really necessarily expected an answer to, but this is a way to keep your audience interested and engaged. Problem and solution. And this will work very nicely for something like the persuasive speech, where you're going to present a problem or an issue that's going to require some action or some thought or belief on the part of the audience. And then hopefully what you are going to be able to show is that your suggestions will help to reduce the severity of the problem, perhaps even solve it in its entirety. Even something like process of elimination, you can go through all of the pieces that don't necessarily make sense in your argument and then be left with the piece that does make sense. And it's not as if one of these processes precludes another. You can mix and match. And in terms of thinking about how to go about doing this, it's all about the speaking outline. where you are basically putting together your arguments in the order that you're likely to be discussing them with your audience. So you can try out lots of different techniques with your speaking outline and then practice the speech based on each of those speaking outlines until you've found a process that seems to make sense. For your speaking outline, it is different than the kind of written outline than you would normally do, for instance, if you were writing a paper. When you're writing a paper, you want your written outline to be as detailed as possible. That's not what we want with the speaking outline. With the speaking outline, we want keywords and phrases. Basically, these are just going to be cues to you in the event that you needed some direction. And again, I kind of likened it to the let's say the trapeze artist who is working without a net. That's not terribly smart, even if the trapeze artist is very skilled and is not likely to fall. And basically, your speaking outline is your net. It would be very silly not to have your speaking outline in front of you just in the event that you needed to reference it. That said, there's a very good possibility that you wouldn't need to reference it because you're so familiar with the content of your speech. And one of the things you can do on your speaking outline is to list stage directions, so you can remind yourself of things that you might want to do with your audience. For instance, show them a particular visual. I've even had students write things down like breathing in terms of their speaking outline so that they can remind themselves to breathe. And that is perhaps one of the biggest challenges in delivering a speech is breathing. Studies have shown that during times of high anxiety, people tend to breathe very irregularly. And that's the reason why we want to focus on nice, deep breaths from the diaphragm. And it's one of the reasons why pauses can be so useful in delivering your speech as well, because basically a pause allows you an opportunity to take a nice, deep breath. Now, I recommend that you use your outline as a hard copy. In other words, that you've got an outline that's on pieces of paper, or that you have an outline on note cards, rather than rely on an electronic copy of your outline. And the reason why is because of the possibility of mechanical failure. So let's say you've got your outline on your laptop, but if your laptop freezes up, then you no longer have access to your outline. So basically having something in front of you. And there's an example on page 119 about drunk driving, about an outline. That's key words and phrases. And again, you can either put that on pieces of paper or on note cards. If you use note cards, I suggest you number the cards just in the event they get out of order. Keep in mind that the outline is ultimately for you, not for the audience. So you can construct it in whatever way that's user-friendly to you. Use whatever font size or colors that seem to be comfortable. That said, for this class, I am going to be asking that you send me a copy of your outline, just so that I can give you some feedback on your particular outline and give you an idea of perhaps some ways that you could perhaps improve. If it turns out that you're using note cards, that's going to be difficult to show me. You might need to scan them or take pictures of them. But one way or another, I would like to be able to take a quick peek at them. If you're writing your outline on paper, then that's much easier, obviously, because then ultimately that's something that you can send to me via an attachment. But I did want to take a little peek at that. And if you wanted a suggestion on how I proceed with outlines, you can just look at the way that I have structured our class notes with each of these videos, where I've basically divided things up into major topics, and then I've got subdivisions under each of those topics. And there's lots of white space around. You know, the formatting is important. It should be something that's fairly easy to skim so that you can still maintain eye contact and you can still maintain a connection with your audience. You can see I'm not using complete sentences. In fact, your outline doesn't even necessarily have to be typed. It could be handwritten. Again, that might be a little bit tricky in terms of your sharing your outline with me, but if you've got a handwritten outline, you could always take a picture of it and send it to me as an attachment. Or you could always scan it and send it to me as an attachment if you so wanted to. And my outlines, sometimes my personal outlines, they either are typed but sometimes they're just handwritten because again, they're for my personal purposes. The last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of that chapter was memory, and the fact that we all have pretty poor memory skills. Different studies have come up with different results, but generally speaking, most students and most people can manage about 7 or more items of information, and probably less rather than more items of information. So it's plus or minus 7. Now, obviously, we remember much more than that, and that's because we utilize lots of memory techniques to help us remember things, such as chunking or grouping like items together. It's one of the things we do with phone numbers, for instance, when we divide up a phone number into 3 digits and then the following 4 digits, so that we don't have to remember individual digits, but we can remember 2 chunks. The first 3 digits as one number, the last 4 digits as another number. There's mnemonics or memory devices, whether they happen to be something like songs or they happen to be acronyms, which is where you're using the first letter of each word to represent something else. This is very common in education in terms of trying to remember things like the notes of a scale or perhaps body parts, and even for something like writing. One of the premier rules of writing happens to be KISS, or keep it simple, silly, though you might have heard it as keep it silly or keep it simple, stupid. It seems a bit harsh. So that plus repetition, over and over and over again, repeating information until ultimately you remember. So what does that mean for you as a speaker? Because you want to be audience centered, which means that you are putting the needs and the expectations of the audience first and foremost. And that while it would be lovely if the audience paid attention to every single statement you made, the reality is that your audience, because of poor listening skills, and we talked about this last class with the internal and external perceptual field, that people will daydream, which is one of the reasons why we encourage note-taking in school, and that the environment will oftentimes influence whether or not people are paying attention, which is why if you've ever been in a classroom and you've seen teachers try to do things like open and close the door to try to manipulate the noise levels that may be coming from the hallway, all of that is trying to manipulate the external perceptual field. Now, that said, there are things that you may not be able to adjust in that environment. But what it does mean for you as a speaker is that there are things that you personally can do, such as repeating information, probably more so than you would in writing, such as offering mnemonic or memory devices for us so that we can remember information, such as chunking things for us or grouping like pieces together, and not expecting us to remember too much, because again, studies have said that most people can remember plus or minus 7 or so items, which isn't very much. So moving forward to the next chapter, chapter 8, talked about beginning and ending speeches. So I'm hopeful that at this point in the semester, you've made some decisions as to what you think you might want to be discussing for your autobiographical speech. And now you're beginning to contemplate how you're going to organize those arguments and how you're going to put together a speaking outline. And as you're doing that, keep in mind something known as the primary recency effect. Again, you can see all of this in our notes for this class. That studies have shown that people best remember what they hear first, or what they read and see first, or what they hear, see, or read last. What does that mean for you as a speaker? That your introduction and conclusion, the beginning and ending of your speech, are going to be particularly important, because that is likely what your audience will best remember. That's not to say that the middle's not important. The middle's very important because that's where your evidence is. But in terms of understanding how memory works, your audience is probably going to best remember how you began and how you ended. So you want to put a little bit of extra effort into the intro and into the conclusion. And once again, if you've written papers for other classes, you've probably had to make these determinations about how to begin and how to end your arguments. And there are lots of different ways you can go about doing this. You can perhaps talk about something that's real and that happens to be timely, because people tend to be very interested in the reality of their world. Or perhaps you can talk about something that's nearby and something, again, that people have some sort of a personal connection with. Or perhaps you could talk about something that's familiar. And people tend to oftentimes be interested in that which is familiar. But they oftentimes are interested in things that oftentimes are, let's say, unfamiliar and even scandalous. So the human experience is one that's filled with lots of contradiction and paradox. If you think about news stories and how oftentimes they will focus on things like suspense or conflict, because that tends to motivate individuals to pay attention. Humor tends to usually be a very effective way to get audiences engaged. But again, humor is very subjective. You want to make sure that your humor is appropriate for your particular audience. Just mentioning that your topic is important is a good way to begin and end a speech. Just by saying that it's important for us to consider something like tax breaks because of COVID-19, let's say. Question and answer. That's another great way to begin and end a speech. Again, you should either provide the answer or the answer should be obvious. That would be a rhetorical question. A quotation is a wonderful way to begin or end a speech or begin or end a paper. The quote has to be relevant to whatever it is that you happen to be discussing. And I always think of a student who began their speech with a rather lengthy quote and didn't let us know that they were beginning their speech with that quote. And they were reading the quote because you want to be exact with your particular quote. And what we had assumed was that the entire speech would be read rather than the speech being conversational. And that's what we'll talk about next class, about the idea of delivering speeches. And the suggestion I gave to that student is that if they had just begun by saying, let me begin with a quote, then we would not at all have been surprised that they were reading, because we knew that that would come to an end and then the delivery would be very different after that. Lots of places you can find quotations, and while you could certainly go on Google, think about the idea that sometimes you can't necessarily trust what you find on Google. If you're looking for one of the definitive sources for something like a quotation, it's Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, which, yes, you can find a version of that online if you wanted to. But if you are using a quote, you want to make sure that you're quoting correctly. I've seen quotes online, for instance, that have been attributed to Shakespeare, and I know very well that those are incorrect. So you want to be cautious when you are gathering information online, which we'll talk about in future classes. Personal references to yourself are also good ways to begin or to end arguments, because people tend to be interested in the writer or the speaker. A startling statement. As I had indicated, that while people want things that are familiar and comforting, they also want conflict, and they want things that are surprising as well. I think I gave you the story about a student who went too far with one of my colleagues at another institution, who began to disrobe when they were delivering a speech about remaining true to oneself. Not a good way to startle the audience. However, I've seen it done well, and I've seen it done well in my own class. And the story I'll share with you happens to be something that occurred in an evening class, and we were in the midst of a break. And immediately after a break, a student was scheduled to deliver a speech. But before the ending of the break, and I was looking at my notes, I wasn't paying attention, and everybody else, they were looking at their phones and so forth, they weren't paying attention. At that point, somebody in the back of the room began coughing, and it looked like that they were choking. And a million thoughts went through my mind, thinking about how I needed to reach the student immediately. Did I remember my Heimlich maneuver? How would I notify security about all of this? Things were moving both very quickly and very slowly at the same time, if you understand what I mean, if you've ever been in a moment of crisis. At any rate, it turns out before I could even leave my chair, another student reached the choking victim and performed the Heimlich, and out popped a rolled ball of paper, which was rather odd. And we all stood there sort of in this surreal moment, rather absurd, looking at this rolled ball of paper on the ground. The student who had performed the Heimlich maneuver calmly walked to the front of the room and announced that what we had just watched was a simulation of a choking. and that if it had been a real choking situation, would we have known what to do? And that his speech was about the Heimlich maneuver. And let me tell you, we were all captivated at that particular point. It was a fantastic way to proceed. And he had planned everything in advance. This choking student was a friend of his who was pretending to choke and had inserted a piece of paper in his mouth so that he could spit it out. And I realized that a lot of things could have gone wrong at that particular point in time. Somebody else could have intervened and actually performed the Heimlich maneuver on this fake choking victim. And ribs can be broken during the Heimlich maneuver. This student who was pretending to choke might actually have begun to choke for real and wouldn't have received the assistance the student needed. Someone in the class might have been traumatized by what they had just seen. So I understand that there was risk involved with this particular technique. I was not aware of what was going to be happening. It was kept a secret from me as well from the class. But I can tell you it was an incredibly effective way for this audience at that time to be engaged in a subject that could be considered kind of dry, which is the Heimlich maneuver. So I'll always remember that speech. Even storytelling, just what I was doing right now. People like to be entertained, and the idea of beginning or ending a speech with a story, again, it has to be relevant. Or just simply forecasting and summarizing in your introduction, telling the audience what you plan on discussing, forecasting it. And then in the conclusion, just summarizing or basically giving a review of what you've just talked about. And you can again mix and match, but these are all ideas that you can consider in terms of thinking about how do I begin and how do I end. And I think I might have shared with you the importance of making sure that you greet your audience before you begin your speech, that you say hello, because that's your cue to the audience that it's time to pay attention. And it also gives you a moment to take a deep breath and to settle. And the importance of, at the end, letting your audience know that you're done. And you can do that as simply as saying thank you, or if you have any questions, let me know. So it doesn't have to be as abrupt as I'm finished now. But the idea that the audience knows that you've concluded at that particular point. So we've talked about organizing and outlining, and we've talked about beginning and ending speeches. Then there's the there's the use of language in speeches. And I know that there's pressure to be as exact and precise as possible when you're writing. And you have the luxury of being able to do that because you are able to revise and you're able to edit. But when you're speaking within the moment. So chances are that your language is not going to be as precise, nor does it need to be. Because ultimately, if you are speaking in front of the public, you want to try to be conversational and use an oral style, as opposed to when you are writing a paper. And what are some of the differences between the two? The oral style is much simpler in terms of its vocabulary, in terms of its sentence structure. It's less formal, as opposed to the written style, which is the exact opposite. And it's one of the reasons why in your outline you want to detail keywords and phrases, because you don't want the pressure of having to state every single sentence precisely. Certainly there might be content that needs to be precise, and certainly if you're offering a quotation, it needs to be precise. But I kind of think of it as preparing for an important conversation. For instance, let's say you wanted to ask your employer for a raise. Hopefully you've spent some time contemplating how to go about doing that, rather than just doing that based on the spur of the moment. And probably you've anticipated some of the arguments of why it is you need a raise. It could be because of your performance. It could be because of your longevity at the company. And perhaps you've also anticipated some of the objections that you might receive, and that the company is experiencing some economic problems. And hopefully you can try to refute or address that yes, the company is experiencing economic problems. However, your performance warrants the fact that the company invests in you because you're able to produce so much that ultimately you're more of an asset than a liability, and they wouldn't want to lose you. Now, whether or not that's going to be effective for you in terms of actually getting a raise, I don't know, but certainly it's something for you to think about in relation to constructing a speech, and that you want to think about your arguments ahead of time and then have key words and ideas to share. Because I think your employer would be rather stunned if you took out a piece of paper and instead of having a conversation with them, you began reading a statement as to why you wanted a raise. So that said, it's the same sort of idea with preparing a speaking outline. You have some points or ideas in your head and hopefully on a piece of paper in the event that you were to forget, so that you could reference them. But within the moment, things will be changing. And certainly the direction might change based on the response that you happen to be getting from your employer when you're asking for a raise, or perhaps from your audience when you are presenting information. So that said, since you don't necessarily have to have that level of precision with writing, there are some things you can do, higher level things, usually higher level skills we talk about in relation to speeches. You can play with definitions once you get comfortable with language and delivering speeches. And most of us are accustomed to the denotation or dictionary definition of a word. You might have heard of connotation or the associations of a word. You need to be very aware of that the dictionary definition and the connotation or the associations could be very different. And I oftentimes use an example of cheap and frugal, where both have the same dictionary definition. You don't spend a lot of money. But frugal is seen as much more positive and cheap is seen as much more negative. So thinking in advance about the kind of language that you might want to use, that if you use the word cheap, it might be viewed as more offensive. If you use the word frugal, it might be viewed as more positive. And keeping that in mind when you are thinking about putting together an argument. You can even give a negative definition. Definitions usually share what something is. A negative definition defines what something is not. So, for instance, if I wanted to give you a negative definition of wealth, I could say that wealth is not based on finances, but it's based on happiness and health. So basically, I've created a definition that you're not likely to find in a dictionary, but yet I've established that as our working definition at that point in time. And obviously, definitions are influenced by context. They're determined by the situation. So I know that in English classes, when I'm talking about being brief, I mean concise. However, in a fashion class, a brief could be an article of clothing, and in a law class, a brief could be a legal report. So depending on the context, you have to think about how your word or how your definition would be understood. And then we talk about things like using imagery, any sensory language that you can use to assist in your audience's visualization, whether it be sight or smell or touch. Advertisers do this very well when they refer to the senses and they're trying to get you to buy a product. So the more you can help your audience visualize, then the more likely it is that your audience can be engaged in your subject matter. You can use things like metaphor, where you're comparing two dissimilar things without using like or as. Because if you use a simile, then you're comparing two dissimilar things, but you are using like and or as. So cold as ice would be a simile, where you're referring to something as being cold and also ice-like. When you're using a metaphor, I think about a sample student speech. I once saw an autobiographical one where the student was talking about themselves and saying that they were red. And they weren't saying that they were like the color red. They said that they were the color red. And actually it was a very interesting speech that was rather effective at the beginning when they began drawing comparisons between themselves and comparisons that are oftentimes associated with the color red. Passion, for instance. That said, as the speech progressed, it became a little bit less concrete and more abstract. So it became more difficult for the audience to follow, which can be one of the challenges. And when you're using a metaphor, when you're stretching a little bit too far. What I remember most about this speech is that the speaker was wearing a green shirt. And while certainly you can make the decision to wear anything that you would like to wear during a speech, the idea of not wearing red in a speech where you are stating that you are the color red will always baffle me. So, but nevertheless, that's something to consider as well, that depending on your speech topic, your clothing might be in one way or another, a way that you can help promote your particular topic. Things like rhyme, when the ending of words sounds similar, or alliteration, where the beginnings of words sound similar. Usually when we think about the great speakers of our time, people like Martin Luther King, we know how often they use things like rhyme and alliteration and metaphor and imagery. And while certainly we can aspire to that, we're also at the place in our public speaking where we are remembering to breathe and to greet our audience and to cue our audience when we're done. In other words, you shouldn't necessarily feel compelled that you've got to write and you've got to present a poetic speech. That's something that you can develop over the course of a lifetime. The idea is that what you do want to present is a speech that is able to communicate with your audience. So your language needs to be precise enough for your audience to understand what you're saying. You can't say the whatchamacallit about the thingamajiggy, but it doesn't have to be as precise as it would be when you're writing. Your language should be audience centered. In other words, it should be appropriate for the audience members. So if you've got a group of children, chances are you're going to be using different vocabulary and talking about different topics than if you were talking to a group of adults. And you also want to try to use neutral terms that are culturally sensitive, terms that are inclusive, within reason. Again, when you're writing, you can be much more precise. And if you've made an error, and you've used, for instance, a word that's not gender neutral, perhaps you've said policeman in your writing, you can go back and change that to police officer. When you're speaking, you might have said policeman, and maybe it's best to just leave it that way than to try to correct it, or worse yet, to try to censor yourself so that you aren't able to communicate with your audience. So those are some of the things that I wanted you to consider. And I am going to be reading your comments about nerves. And in terms of nerves, some of the suggestions that I have, and it's in no way revolutionary, is thinking about things like making sure that you're breathing deeply and well, making sure that you are well prepared. Because the more prepared you are in knowing the information, the less likely you are to be nervous. You might want to have access to some water, because oftentimes if you're speaking, you might get a dry throat. You want to know yourself well. You know what you need in terms of sleep and food and drink, and you should listen to your body and make sure that you're not depriving your body of something or overwhelming your body, because delivering a speech already adds a certain level of stress. So you want to try to reduce stress as much as possible. One of the things I'll be talking about over the course of the semester are some perhaps holistic ways that you can reduce stress. Things like scent has been found to reduce stress, lavender in particular. Things like color and sound has been found to reduce stress. So we'll talk about some of those techniques as well as the semester progresses. I always suggest to students that they wear something that's, yes, appropriate, but also comfortable when they're delivering a speech, because you don't necessarily want to be thinking about how uncomfortable your clothing is when you are delivering a speech. So that's another suggestion as well. So, but I'm looking forward to hear what some of your suggestions were, or I should say I'm looking forward to reading what some of your suggestions happen to be. And by the time you view this video, I may have already reviewed those suggestions and made commentary back to you. In terms of today's attendance question for you to talk about on our blog, or I should say for you to talk about on our discussion forum, our attendance question today is, what do you think is going to be your biggest challenge in delivering speech number 1, and why? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious to hear what you're thinking some of your challenges might be, and I'm hopeful that I and your classmates can give you some suggestions on ways to reduce those challenges. So I hope you're well, I'm well, and we'll see each other soon, so to speak. Take care.